We'll talk about what is a policy brief, who are your readers, defining the policy actors, and choosing your content. So to begin, what is a policy brief? A policy brief is a document that presents the findings of your research and recommends a particular policy outcome to a non-specialized audience. The key here is that you're providing policy advice to a non-academic audience, to policy actors. And the policy actors might be official actors, such as members of Congress, state legislators, mayors, or the policy actors can be unofficial actors, such as journalists, interest groups, civic leaders. There's a variety of folks that we might want to communicate our research to, and we want to think very carefully about how we take that research and distill it for a non-specialized audience. So one of the things that academics are not always good at is being jargon-free. But for a policy brief, we want to make sure that we are thinking very carefully about writing for a general audience. We want to explore the issues in our research and distill the lessons learned. It's a brief for a reason. Policymakers do not want to read a long document. They don't have the patience, the time to do that. So you should think of a very short document, a standalone document focused on a single topic. Who are your readers? This is important to consider who your audience is. Before you start writing, you really need to identify for whom are you writing the brief. You want to identify the relevant policy actors in your particular area. Who are the people who drive the policy process on your topic? One example is I wrote a policy brief on autonomous vehicles. And autonomous vehicles, it's an area where the federal government has done a little bit of work, but the major piece of legislation on it is stuck in Congress, just like so many issues are stuck in Congress and not moving. So it didn't make sense for me to write the policy brief geared toward members of Congress, the U.S. Congress, but at the state level, there are many, many state legislatures who are working on legislation dealing with autonomous vehicles. So that's where I geared my policy brief toward, for those state legislators who are working on specific pieces of legislation. So whatever your research area is, whatever your topic of interest is, you want to do the legwork to figure out, all right, where is the policy making happening on this issue? Is it a state level issue? Is it a local issue? Are interest groups really the ones you want to try to communicate to? So figuring out who your readers are critical.
Rosalie, if I may just interrupt you for a second, I just wanted to make sure, were you moving the slides as you were talking?
Is it not showing?
No, so for us, it's just showing that the first slide that you put up. I believe for the audience also, it's not moving.
All right, let me look here. What's happening now?
I see the same thing where it's just the title slide that's on the screen.
On mine, it shows it moving.
Do you want to unshare the screen and then try sharing it again? Maybe that would work.
Yeah, hold on just a second.
Thank you. Yeah.
What about now?
No, I still see just the title slide.
Mine says it's sharing content.
Just check, maybe you can control it from WebEx itself. So at the bottom of the screen, is there a way for you to move the slides from WebEx? Or there should be some buttons on the left side of your screen. Maybe that would work.
Yeah, that's what I'm clicking. Does that do anything?
No, it's still showing.
Ellen said in the chat that hers says it's showing Kate's screen.
Okay.
I don't know if
so. Okay, so I just, yeah, the screen changed now. It says planning, formatting, designing, distributing. That's what the slide says. Is that the slide you have up now? No?
Okay, now it says I'm the presenter.
Okay, hang on. Okay, now, does it say you're the presenter now?
Yeah.
Okay, so now see if you can go back and forth with the slides. Okay, perfect. Yes, I think that worked. Yes.
Okay.
So what is a policy brief? Is that where you're at?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm glad that.
All right. I'm sorry. No. Everyone. Thank you.
No, it's all good. Thank you. I'm sorry. It's we're all working out kinks, so I'm glad it worked out.
We're gonna roll with the punches here.
Great. Thank you, Rosalie.
All right. So I believe I was talking about identifying the actors. And, the key here is figuring out who is doing the real policy work on your research area and then writing the brief for them. And when you're considering the policy actors, some key issues to consider is how knowledgeable they are about the topic of your brief. Oftentimes as scholars, we feel like what we do is so normal and that everybody has a good understanding of what we do, and we take for granted what experts we are. And so you may feel like, oh, I'm not sure I have anything to share with a journalist or with a policymaker, but indeed you do. And thinking very carefully about how to pitch that at the level that can explain it to a general audience is key. And different policy actors are going to have different level of expertise about your topic. And, if you have a staffer for a member of Congress who's really an expert already on the topic, they're going to need one level in a policy brief. Whereas if you're, trying to influence a state legislator who may share staffers with 3 or 4 other state legislators, or maybe the intern is actually the one who's doing the work on your issue, then there's different levels, and you want to figure out, okay, what's the knowledge level and how do I need to pitch this? The other issue is how open are they to the message? And so, of course, with policy making, it is often partisan, and so figuring out the key folks that you're interested in talking to, are they going to be open to your message? And you really have to think about how to frame your message so that you can get the information to them without a partisan lens getting in the way. Now, how can you reach your audience? It's really important that you anticipate your audience's needs, interests, and concerns. If a legislator, for example, is working on a particular issue, then they have some urgency where they need the information you're providing. And you want to describe why it is important and why they need to understand the urgency of it. Outline the benefits and advantages of the policy recommendation that you're making. You want to be persuasive, but of course factual. When you make a policy recommendation based on your research, you of course want to make sure that you're not cherry picking the data. If you do that, you will lose credibility very quickly. And so you want to provide this evidence-based approach to policymakers so that they know that they can trust you and that they will take your policy recommendations very seriously. Some people even recommend putting forth a couple of different policy options. So if you're someone, I know some scholars are familiar, are not comfortable saying, okay, it must be this policy option. You instead may want to think through what are a couple of different policy options that you could put forth and then talk about the pros and cons of the different possibilities. Now, choosing your content. So if you have a published article and you want to write a policy brief based on that article, you don't want to go into all the details. You don't want to cover every single aspect. You want to figure out, okay, what is the single topic and the main point? What do I really want to convey? Define your purpose. You can identify up to 3 supporting items that bolster that overall point. But you're keeping it simple, you're keeping it straightforward. And very importantly, you're limiting it to 1 page. So I recommend for a policy brief that it can be back and front, but anything more than a page is unlikely to be read by policymakers. Anything with a staple, anything with a paperclip is likely to get tossed aside. And so you really want to keep it brief, a policy brief, right? And so that is critical. And then policymakers will follow up with you. If they want to know more, they're going to reach out, and then you can provide that 5-page or 10-page white paper. But a policy brief is specifically meant to be very tight, succinct, that gets your main point across without all the details. Let's talk a little bit about the format. How you write the introduction, the approaches and results, conclusion, and then the implications and recommendations. The introduction should answer the why question. You want to convince people why they should read your brief. Why should they care about it? Why is this important? You want to explain the essence of the brief in that introduction, provide an overview of the findings and conclusions, and make the reader curious to read the rest of the brief. You basically have to assume that they will only read the introduction. So you want to pack it all into the introduction, convince them to hopefully keep reading, but even if they don't, you want to get the key point across. That's critical. In the body of the brief, you're going to go into how the study was conducted, or you may be reviewing several studies, and you can talk about the studies as a set. You want to give enough background so that non-experts can understand, but again, you don't need all the details. You provide a summary of the findings and describe the issue in context. In some instances, it may be really important to identify the method used to collect the data, and so that can be included as well. You want to convey very clearly, what do we know about this topic? What do scholars know? What are the results? These should be clear and concise, again, facts only. Describe the analysis, but do not be overly technical. You want to start with the general picture and move to the specific and really highlight the results that drive your point. You don't have to report every detail in a study. It's fine to really focus in on the key points and articulate that in a jargon-free way intended for a general audience, a policymaker, official or unofficial, who doesn't have expertise on the topic. The conclusion should be very concrete. It should be based on what you've already written, based on the results, be clear how it all fits together, and highlight any benefits, limitations, or opportunities. Now, the next section is really the most important section, where you have this results and evidence that leads to a conclusion, and then you're going to draw some implications out and or recommendations. So implications are really what could happen. Recommendations are what should happen. So implications, there you're going to spell out what does this mean for the audience. You'll describe the consequences of the policy. It's less direct than specific recommendations, a softer approach, but still can be very, very persuasive. Again, you want to think back about who's your audience, how open are they, how knowledgeable are they, and there may be instances when focusing on the implications may be more persuasive than making an outright policy recommendation. Recommendations then are what should happen. You want to describe clearly what the next step should be, and you want to state those as precise steps and ensure that the steps are relevant, credible, and feasible. Again, keep in mind your audience. You know, you don't want to write to a mayor and submit a policy brief that is really about what a state legislature needs to do. You want to make sure that you're making policy recommendations that are in keeping with the person's position of power and what they actually have control over and what they can influence. And same with if it's unofficial actors, with a civic leader or a journalist. You want to make it very clear what your recommendation is, and keep in mind that it needs to be something that is feasible and relevant to what they are working on. Now, what about designing? How do you put this all together? Here I'll talk about titles, sidebars, call-outs, and more. So titles, you want to have a catchy title, but still be professional. Academics love colons. Avoid colons. Just don't even go there. Forget the colon. Save that for your academic journal article. You want to use subheadings to break up the text, and both the title and the subheading should grab the reader's attention. The formatting is all about getting the policymaker's attention. They're so busy, they get so much thrown at them. You want to have a really polished document that will grab their attention. In the document, in the body of it, you might include a sidebar, something that's short and descriptive, extra to the main discussion, something that might really hook your reader, something that might focus on action. One example here would be if you're writing a brief for a state legislator in a particular area, you might provide a little sidebar where it talks specifically about the lab you're working in or what a particular area of campus is doing, so tying it directly to something at Purdue, and not just speaking about the research in general, but how does this fit with Purdue because of Purdue's credibility as a state legislature, you know, really calling out, okay, this is what's happening at Purdue, could be a nice sidebar in some of the policy. Call-outs, that's when you format the document so that you have specific sentences or phrases that are bolded or printed in a larger font. These might be set aside in a box. This is all something that's visually appealing that helps call attention to the key aspects, the key points of your policy brief. Bulleted lists can be helpful. You don't want too many bullets, so maybe 4 or 5 bullets, and you want to use complete sentences so that a reader can quickly look at those bullet points and digest what information is there without reading the whole brief, but they need to be coherent sentences for you to really convey the information. Graphics are great. That really helps draw attention and can explain complicated information. So that is really highly recommended graphic, but it has to be done well. A sloppy graphic or a graphic that is too complicated for a general audience isn't going to help. So you really have to think carefully about, can you design a graphic that allows you to convey the information to a general audience. After writing, All right, this is obvious to us as scholars, as we write all the time, that we want to proofread and revise. But it really is a fundamentally different type of writing than the kind of writing we do for a journal or for a book manuscript. We're using everyday language, we're telling a story, and we want to, of course, use active voice. It's a kind of writing, ideally it's the kind of writing we would do all the time in journals or in our book manuscripts, but oftentimes we don't as academics. So it really is something that you need to learn how to do, how to pitch it for that general audience. And one way that I think about it is, how do I take material and translate it for students when I'm teaching? And the same way you might kind of take material and distill it down and pitch it at the right level for an undergraduate student is the same way in which you might write this policy brief, where you're talking to smart people, people who are engaged, but that you really need to use language that they can understand and tell a story and draw them in to the policy brief. The first time when I did this and Scholar Strategy Network staff gave me feedback, I really worked a lot on it. I was like, oh, I think this is really great with communicating to a general audience. And the Scholar Strategy Network people took it and marked it all up and reorganized it and helped me with a different lead sentence. And so there really is an art to doing this. And that's why I really encourage you, if you're interested in this policy brief, of really communicating to a broader audience, that having the help of Scholar Strategy Network is very valuable, because they have experts in this who are doing this kind of writing all the time and can really give you the kind of input you need on communicating your ideas. Now, how do I cite the research? Okay, policy briefs do not require a reference page. Now, this is just anathema to everything we've been taught as scholars, right? We always think we have to have a reference page and everything cited. But because this is a document that's written for a general audience, that is written for policy actors, we do not need a reference sheet. They don't want to see references. It's not what they're interested in. They want you to distill it for them and communicate the expertise without ever looking at any references. Now, what you might do if you're drawing from like a specific article, you might put the citation of that at the bottom of the policy brief, or if you're sharing it electronically, you can embed the link into the policy brief so that if they do want to click on a particular article, they can do so. But really what happens is, if somebody is convinced and persuaded by your brief and they want to learn more, then they will contact you, and then you can provide them with additional resources and citations and like I said before, maybe a longer paper once you have caught their interest. But that reference page is not needed at this stage. All right, distributing now. So once you have your policy brief all written, who are you going to circulate it to, and how will you circulate it? So, as I said, you want to research who your policy actors are, who the most relevant people are. You don't want to just send your policy brief out everywhere. You want to figure out specific people to send it to, and these are not going to be, the most senior policy actors in this area. You're going to figure out who's the key staffers who are working on the issue. For example, if you send it to a member of Congress or even a state legislator, you send it to an interest group, you're going to want to figure out, okay, who's the staff member who's really working on this particular piece of the puzzle? And so doing that legwork, identifying who are the relevant actors is very important, and sending it to them is key. And you can send it, hard copy, but also, most likely you'll be sending it electronically. You want to follow up. So you just send this out and forget about it. You're not going to get much attention. But you can make that personal contact. Try a phone call. I know in this age of email, we don't like to do phone calls anymore, but sometimes the best way to draw attention is to make that phone call. And then you'll find out maybe that's not the most relevant person that you sent it to, but they will help you get it to the right person. So doing that follow-up, doing that contact is really critical to getting your research out there. The other way is to be proactive and to hold a seminar and invite the actual policy actors to your gathering. And, this is even more, it's easier today than it was, a year ago. In the age of Zoom, you might be able to invite policy actors and get them to come to your gathering in a way that we couldn't before. But it's still important that you're identifying the right policy actors, and that if you're putting together a seminar like this, you want to make sure it will truly be valuable for those policy actors. And one way to do that is to make sure that you're communicating with the policy actors ahead of time and even soliciting their input on what kind of information do they need. Let the stakeholders tell you what kind of a policy brief on what aspect of the policy would be most helpful. And then you can cater to their needs, cater to their interests, and what kind of seminar would be most helpful for them. That will help you draw policy actors in and make your communication of your research most valuable and most helpful. And, PPRI has experience doing these kinds of seminars. So if you have an idea for a workshop or a seminar, I would definitely recommend talking to Stacy about what your ideas are, and possibly PPRI could help cultivate those and figure out and help you work on how you put something together for policy actors. You also want to seek out opportunities to work with the policy actors directly. So I mentioned, cultivating the stakeholders. If you're working on a particular area and the stakeholders, the policymakers have no idea who you are, it's not going to be that likely that they're going to pay attention to your policy brief. But if you cultivate relationships, find out what's happening in that space, and share your research, share the information, find out what they need to know, then you're taking advantage of opportunities to work with the policy actors directly, and they're going to be much more open to what you have to say. Seize opportunities. So have copies of your policy brief with you if you're attending events. Of course, I know these days we aren't attending that many events, but in theory, when you're attending events, have those briefs with you. Be ready to share them. Be ready to have a little elevator pitch that you're going to talk to, a member of an interest group or a journalist or a state legislator or a mayor, city council, whatever it is. Be ready to be prepared to share your brief and to share your 1-minute summary of what your research is and what you're advocating. It's especially good to capitalize on any press coverage or high-profile events. So, this summer when the Black Lives Matter movement and the social unrest and the protests were going strong, then that was a great time for, unfortunately, for scholars who were doing work on protests and race relations and anti-racism to get their information out to journalists and to policymakers. There was a real demand for it because of the events on the street. So you want to be responsive to what is happening in the real world in your policy area, in your research area, so that you can pull together a brief pretty quickly and respond. And that's one of the best ways to get, especially with journalists, to get attention to the research you're doing. They want to peg it to a particular event that's happening. And so that's a good way to get your research out there. And then learn from and connect with similar campaigns. So other organizations, other groups, social movements who are working in your area, connecting with them is also a good way to seize opportunities and to get your research out there. Use social media. So this is something that I think is really critical, building an online presence. Uploading the policy brief to your website is really critical. Writing a blog about your findings might be one way to do this. PPRI hosts a spot on their website where they post policy briefs. So as you work on your policy brief, you can talk to Stacy and Krista about possibly having your policy brief hosted on the PPRI website. PPRI also has a blog, and perhaps you could write a blog post for their website on your particular research. That's a great way to start getting information out about what you're working on. And then promoting your policy brief via Twitter or other forms of social media is a great way to get your research out there. The Scholar Strategy Network had a training, I guess it was 2 years ago now, in DC, and they had the editorial page folks from major newspapers on a panel where they were talking about how they get ideas for editorials and for op-eds. And one of the key things they said is that they're following Twitter. And so academics who are getting their message out over Twitter is a great way to kind of get attention, draw attention to your work, and make a policymaker, journalist, civic leader more open to reading what you're writing about. So I am going to close there, and I will take questions now, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about writing this policy brief or about Scholar Strategy Network.
Great. Thank you so much, Rosalie. That was a really informative and I think very, very timely presentation. I think everybody would find it very helpful. So to all the participants, if you wanted to just type out any questions that you may have in the Q&A space that we have on the side, that would be helpful, and then we can try and have Rosalie address any of your questions or queries, and that would be great. Can we access these PowerPoint slides? That question has been, so I guess this is something that we would need to see. Rosalie, would you be willing to share the presentation?
I would be happy to share the presentation, yeah.
Okay.
So I will share it with you, and then you can decide what's the best way to get it out to folks.
Yes.
And I probably should post it on my own website as well. It might be helpful there.
Right,
so
right.
It's not there right now, but it could be.
Right. Okay, sounds good. So perfect. So let's see. So yeah, we will make sure that we get this information out to all of the different, or at least make it available to all of the different participants. There's another question that we have, and this is from Chelsea, and she's asking, this is incredibly informative, but what she's asking is, oh, I lost the question, sorry. She's asking what level of scholars are known to do things like this or have an impact on policy making, so master's level, PhD, professors, and I think that's a very good question to see at what level you can make that kind of an impact.
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, I think at all levels, scholars can make an impact. And I'll start with kind of undergraduates. I use in my data science and public policy course, I use a version of this presentation, and the main writing assignment for that course is for the students to do a policy brief. And the first time I taught the course, I'm teaching it for the second time this time, but first time I taught the course was in fall of 2019. And out of 14 students in the class, I had 4 students who wrote such wonderful policy briefs that I had them polish them up and worked with PPRI on getting them formatted into a nice format. And they are now posted on PPRI's website. And they are excellent policy briefs. They're not based on their own original research. So instead, they're based on a summary of existing research in particular areas. So one a student, for example, looked at the use of algorithms in policing and the racial bias. It's an excellent brief. So even undergrads can do this, but for those who are at the graduate level, graduate school level and beyond, once you have a published piece, I would say take that right away and write a policy brief from it. That is what a lot of scholars in SSN do, is the minute their publication comes out, they have a policy brief ready to go to circulate based on that published research. And that is a great way to have impact if you can point back to the published research and then use that to base your policy recommendation on it. And, obviously if you're, a distinguished professor with tons of research under your belt and lots of publications and many grants and all of that, you're probably more likely to be able to get your policy brief out there. You've spent a career of building these kinds of relationships. But there's no reason why at all levels you can't start to build these relationships and get the policy brief information out to the stakeholders. And I will say at Purdue, Purdue is a university that truly values this kind of engagement. And so, in the promotion and tenure process, there's actually a box you check with engagement. And so policy briefs like this can go in that section, and it is highly valued by the university. Now, there are some universities, I've learned through Scholar Strategy Network and interacting with scholars from across the country, where some universities where they don't want their faculty out publishing these kinds of briefs and op-eds because they're nervous about the political implications of it. But Purdue, thankfully, is really quite proud of their faculty and want their faculty to go out and make this kind of impact on society generally. So I would say it can be done at all levels, and it's beneficial to your career at all levels, assistant, associate, full professor.
Great, thank you. I think as you were discussing this, I had another question from a student perspective. Do you think it makes sense for students to think about translating their, say, doctoral dissertations into a policy brief as well?
I do. I think that's a great, kind of first step. Mm-hmm. And I think it can help, obviously shape policymaking, get your research out there, but it also can help you make the connections that can then feed back into your research. And so whatever topic you're working on for your dissertation, you get that input, interact with stakeholders, get some input, and it may shape what your next project is. So it really is a two-way street. So a lot of times, I think I presented this a lot as we are going to communicate our expertise to stakeholders, but we need to be able to take it in as well and learn from the policymakers and the different stakeholders. What do they need? What do they know? And that can influence what briefs we write and what research we do. And that's really a good synergy that builds to better research that will help society.
Right. Yeah, and I think, as we are discussing, I think for graduate students, whether at the master's level or doctoral level, to even begin to have that vehicle to make those kinds of connections that you were talking about, I think as they're starting out in their careers, would be a great way to kind of not only get their information out, get their research out, but also, put a little bit of a bug in somebody's ear about their presence in that area or in that field. So I think that's a great way to do that. So excellent. Thank you. Okay. So another question that we have is about writing policy briefs in the international context. And this is in organizations and institutions in which multiple countries are represented. And so the question is, are there any suggestions about how to tackle that kind of a space?
That's a good question. I don't have experience. I do American politics. I'm very focused on, U.S. politics. So I don't have experience myself with writing kind of for a more international audience. But I guess I would say that I think the kind of principles are the same. and doing the kind of networking, figuring out who the relevant policy actors are, figuring out who the staff members of those relevant policy actors are, and then reaching out to them and networking with them. So I think a lot of the principles are the same, but unfortunately I don't have firsthand experience myself with that. And it may be something that maybe Stacy wants to comment on later on, or maybe you have yourself, Dr. Krishna, have experience with that.
Yeah, and my work has been international mainly, and I've only sort of started doing domestic work in the last couple of years. And it, as you said, there's a very sort of similar kind of a reception to these kinds of policy briefs when we are even talking about international institutions and organizations, the World Bank. In my particular area, UNESCO is a very obvious example. And so, those kinds of organizations typically have been pretty open to, getting all of these different perspectives to, see how they can improve on their own approach, particularly in underserved countries. And that's often been, through a UN perspective, that's often been a very important way in which they begin to engage with professionals and scholars. So absolutely, I think, a lot of that translates internationally as well. Okay, great. Another question that we had is, are think tanks open to these types of briefs, or is it a different or a varied format in that instance?
I think think tanks are often tied with putting out policy briefs themselves. So they may be less open to your policy brief, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't network with them. I would still think of them as a potential stakeholder, as someone, if there's a particular think tank that is very influential in your policy area, then you want to get to know those folks, who's writing on it, who's doing what research. And you might also see, okay, where are they publishing? If they're doing op-eds or if they're circulating policy briefs, what is their network? Who are they contacting? And so I'm not sure necessarily you would target your policy brief to a think tank, but certainly you would want to network with them and learn from them and have them as part of thinking about who's a stakeholder in the particular policy.
Great. Any other questions from any participants? I do have, while we are waiting for some more questions, I have a very specific question regarding SSN, and that's got to do with, are there any requirements for students who want to join the Scholar Strategy Network?
So for students, they do want you to have a published piece already. So graduate students who are working on who have a published piece or have their dissertation almost ready to go, that is the best way to become a member of SSN. Now it's not just a policy brief. SSN, if you've written an op-ed or if you've provided commentary at a hearing, that can also count as a criterion for joining SSN. So if you look at the Scholar Strategy Network website, they have a list and information about what they will accept. Basically, you apply, and then you have to show you have done something that demonstrates your commitment to interacting with policymakers, such as writing a policy brief or writing an op-ed. Now, for scholars who are assistant professors, associate full, obviously you all have published pieces already. And so then just showing, that you've taken one of your published pieces and written a policy brief or an op-ed, that kind of thing, will meet the criteria for joining Scholar Strategy Network. And they have such great resources to help you communicate, to write that op-ed, to write a policy brief. I really, I'm a co-leader here, so I'm totally biased. But I really plug it as being extraordinarily helpful if you want to get your research out to policymakers.
Great, that's excellent. And then there's another question that says, do policy briefs usually work better or become more persuasive with audiences when they are organized through quantitative data?
I think a policy brief could be based on quantitative or qualitative data. I think that the key thing is just making sure you articulate in the brief what kind of data you're drawing off of. But I think there's no reason why qualitative data cannot be persuasive. Empirical data, it can be persuasive regardless of the exact type of data collection. And the key thing is knowing how to portray it, how to present it in a visually appealing way. And so, whether it's through charts or graphs or tables, having that visual image with it is very, very important.
I would second that as somebody who mainly works with qualitative data. Absolutely. There is, I think mixed methods, qualitative work, quantitative work, each of those can be made very persuasive through all of the different strategies that you actually outlined. So absolutely, that's great. I think another question that I may pose, if I may, while we're still waiting for some other questions to come up, is do you see any other ways in which you could get, these kinds of policy briefs out there, particularly if they are, very topical and urgent? And so you outlined a lot of different ways. So in terms of, avenues for publishing them, apart from our own sort of websites or blogs, and then, like you mentioned rightly, PPRI has a vehicle that a lot of our scholars can use as well. Are there any other ways in which, scholars could publish or at least post their policy briefs, like any specific targeted resources?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Katie may be able to speak to this more in terms of where to put op-eds. But I think that for policy briefs, the key thing is to get it into the hands of the policymakers that you want to talk to. And so getting it up on a website is great, and I highly recommend that. But more importantly is let's say you're interested in a state legislator who's working on policy X in a particular session. You want to get it in their hands. You want to get it in front of them. And so going back to that personal connection, they're not going to be looking at all the websites, but they're going to be looking at what their staff member puts in front of them. And so that is really a very key to get it into their hands, to get them to pay attention to it. So it's the networking kind of happening that's really important to get your research out there. And then just also building a reputation. So it's an over time phenomenon. You're not going to all of a sudden be able to write a brief and everyone's going to come knocking on your door, right? You've got to, over time, build a reputation for putting out information on a particular topic and for being a real expert on a topic. And then at that point, the staffer may come to you and say, what do you have on this? I need help with this. So it's an overtime phenomenon. You're not just all of a sudden going to become the expert that somebody comes to. You've got to build that reputation and put out those policy briefs and op-eds to make those connections.
Perfect. And so I think we have one last question, and this is from Professor Hwansuk Song from Communication. To what extent would you say policymakers also do searches in brief repositories, such as the one by SSN? How would that compare to the extent to which scholars try to deliver their work to policymakers directly?
I think that the SSN repository is really helpful, especially for journalists. And so the journalists will go to that repository and look for who's doing work on X, Y, Z, and will then reach out. Then you get a chance to get quoted in the New York Times or the Lafayette Journal and Courier, and then that helps build your reputation. That then drives people to the to your work wherever it is, whether it's on the PPRI site or SSN. So I think that the repositories are really super helpful for journalists because they're doing that kind of legwork to find out who's an expert out there. And let me just, on this slide, I have the PPRI link. And if you go to the PPRI link and look for policy research, you can click through that and see the briefs they have there. The Scholar Strategy Network has a ton of briefs, and you can look on different topics and see lots of examples. And then I also want to credit the Population Reference Bureau guidelines for writing a policy brief, because some of this presentation was built off of their guidelines, and that's an excellent website too if you want further information on writing a policy brief.
Okay, that is excellent. I think it was very, very informative. I certainly found it very helpful, so I hope all of our participants did too. And I really want to thank you again, Dr. Clausen, for this really helpful presentation. And I think our next speaker is ready to go. If we want to take maybe a minute or two to kind of transition between the two presentations, we'll get started at exactly 2 o'clock with Dr. Brownell, who will be talking about her experiences with op-eds. So we will reconnect in, well, we will, get started in a minute or two. But in the meantime, please feel free. If you have any more questions, you can connect with us, and we'll try and get them, across to our presenters, even offline once we get done with the session. So thank you so much, Rosalie. And we'll be back in a minute or two with our next speaker. Welcome back, everyone. We are ready to get started with our second session of this very interesting and informative discussion that we are having today. And for this session, we have with us Dr. Katie Brownell, and she is an associate professor of history as well as a co-editor of Washington Post's History in the Making. And she is going to lead us through an overview of how to work on op-eds and how to really get the most out of that kind of medium. So, Katie, I will hand it off to you, and we will take it from there. And just let me know if you are able to control your slides. Let's see. Oh, we can't hear you. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, now I can hear you. Perfect.
Oh, you can hear me? Okay.
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay.
Earlier, I think you were muted. And
okay.
I am able to see your presentation. If you just want to just click on the next one just to check if it's working. Yep. Perfect. Yes, okay.
So, and you can hear me? We're good?
Yes, great. All good.
I have been doing a lot of Zoom lately, so WebEx is new to me this semester. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the opportunity and putting together this really important workshop on public engagement and the various ways that as scholars we can get our research out to the broader public to show why it matters and the impact that it can have in shaping policy and public conversations as well. I am an associate professor in the history department. I specialize in studying 20th century American politics and media. And so I know how important media narratives are to, and the reverberations that these narratives have had across political history. And that's one of the things that really brought me to this current project with the Washington Post, which is our column Made by History. This is part of the Outlook section of the Post, and it is run by other professional historians. I worked with Brian Rosenwald, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, Nicole Hemmer, who is at Columbia University now, to launch this in 2017. And it really came out of a frustration that we had of the lack of historical analysis in contemporary politics. Frequently, historians were called to talk about certain elements, whether they were unprecedented or not. But that really was about the limit in terms of those conversations. And we thought we wanted to establish a venue where historians could bring their expertise on a daily basis, not just once in a while. And over the past 3 years, I have learned quite a bit as an editor of this column. And that's what I thought that I would share with you. I write frequently for this and a variety of other media outlets because I do think it's so important to bring scholarly or historical expertise to the broader public. So I'm going to share my experiences on op-ed writing, both as a writer and as an editor. And I just emphasize, and I can talk more about the importance of doing this, but I think that there are 3 levels of importance of why you as a scholar should be thinking about writing op-eds, thinking about writing, translating your scholarship to the broader public. The first is that it's important for democracy. It's important for policy discussions to have experts that know the depth, the nuances of particular policies, to have them shaping public conversations. And so policy briefs that Rosie talked about is absolutely one way, but this is another way to get your expertise out there and to shape the ways in which people are talking about current events. So frequently it's dominated by partisan agendas, left versus right, Republican versus Democrat. But in fact, as scholars, we know that there's so much more nuance and complexity, and we can bring that to the broader public and change those conversations in really productive ways. It's also really good for your career as a scholar. I think that one of the myths that I have encountered frequently is that public engagement is a distraction from your scholarship. That, writing op-eds, it takes time away when you should be publishing in peer-reviewed journals. I strongly disagree with that because I think that my work, my public writing has truly enhanced my scholarship. It's made me a better writer. It helps me think through my ideas. And it also helps me network within the broader profession. There are many of my colleagues who may not read my book, but they may read several of my op-eds, and they know my take on history. They know my argument. So it's a great way to get your scholarship out there to your academic networks as well. And I know some of my colleagues may be more likely to assign one of my op-eds than necessarily the entire book if they're teaching a broad class, and only one day perhaps focuses on the 1960 election. So, and it's, again, a way for you to meet other people in the field to get them aware of your work. And I can talk about the other dynamics as well in the Q&A about how you can build this into your tenure portfolio, use it for writing grants. All of those other things are ways in which it can help your scholarship and really inform your scholarship as well. And the third point about why I think you should really take seriously this opportunity to write for the broader public is it's really good for your profession. Because I see this frequently as a historian. Again, partisans across the political spectrum like to see themselves as experts on history, and they're weaponizing that history for their own purposes. And that then misconstrues what we as historians actually do in the broader public. And I think that that's important across disciplines, across a variety of different fields, that if you're not shaping the conversation about medicine or science, those people who don't necessarily have your expertise are. And so it's really important to promoting your profession and what you do in the broader public. So again, I can talk more about why you should get involved in writing for the public. But what I wanted to do today, since it's more of a workshop focus, is to really go through the nuts and bolts of how to do this. And I will try to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm just going to give you an overview. There's a lot I can talk about, and so I'm happy to redirect the conversation depending on what you might find interesting. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that there are two different types of op-ed writing. There is commentary. This is the classic op-ed writing that goes in opinion sections. It's a piece that makes an argument. It can be a moral, a political, a historical, or a policy-based argument. And here, you're really looking to make a unique point about what's in the news, why we need certain policies, for example, or why a particular candidate is a poor choice in an election. It kind of blends your expertise and opinion. It frequently has language like, we should do this. It has a prescription for a solution. And a lot of times this can be, a scholar who's also writing as a citizen. You saw this a lot with some of the debates about Confederate monuments, for example. People make strong arguments about what we should do moving forward that may be grounded in their expertise, but also may bring in their personal viewpoints at certain times. Again, during the 2020 election, there's quite a bit of this as well. That goes in the opinion section. And one of the things that's really important to know that I did not know until working with the Washington Post is that opinion and news are they're completely different sections. They have different requirements. And so if you want to make an argument that advances your opinion, even if it's grounded in your expertise, and you want to say something should happen or we must do this, we must address these issues as a moral issue, you'll have to look to the opinion pages. What we do at Made by History, we are part of the news section. And so our pieces focus overwhelmingly on analysis and perspective, providing more information about the news and more of a lens of how we should understand the stakes of the issue as they play out today. You still want to make a bold and strong argument, but it needs to be more firmly rooted in your expertise and should really stick to what you are saying as an expert. You're saying this with your scholar's hat on, not as an informed citizen, but as a scholar. And in many ways, you want to think of yourself as representing your profession or your institution. What does the scholarship say about what you should do on a particular issue? A lot of times we have to take out that we should and really say that the scholarship on this issue shows these are the stakes and these are the consequences. So sometimes it's just a matter of framing, but if you're in the news section, you really want to foreground the analysis and the expertise. And so that's really what we do in our section. That's what I'm going to focus on through this different perspective, or through this workshop. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of ways in which you can approach the news. And again, because I'm a historian and I run a section on history, these are really grounded in history, but I tried to bring out a variety of different topics as well. And one of the ways to approach the news cycle and to insert yourself into that conversation is to explain why something perhaps is happening. And this is, I'm going to draw on here one of my most recent pieces that I wrote on election news or election results, the coverage of election results, how news has really shaped our understanding of winners and losers and why we expect instantaneous results. I would emphasize that this is something that comes out of my research, but I also had plenty of time to prepare for this. I knew that it was coming. And so I was able to think, okay, this event is coming in the near future. My research says something about why people have started this hunger to consume news. And so I can plan this. So this is an opportunity to kind of think about how you don't necessarily always have to be responding to the news cycle, but you can think about certain events that are linked to the political cycle or the calendar year, certain holidays, certain decisions, legislative decisions that you know are going to be coming out, and you can prepare for it. And what I've done here, and you'll actually see this in all 3 of the examples I'm going to share with you, is that there are 3 components for the introduction of almost every op-ed. And these are really, it doesn't matter if you're writing for a history column like ours, or if you're writing for a different section of the Washington Post or other newspapers, you need these 3 elements. And I would bet that any editor would agree with this. The first is the news hook, and that's what you see here in yellow. This is, okay, what's happening in the news? Why should we care about this, right? So what is going on in the news? This is something where you imagine that you're scrolling on the phone, right, or scrolling news headlines on your phone. What is happening today that people might want to know about? So in this, it's very clear that people are going to start election returns. At that time, President Trump insisted that there needed to be a winner that was declared on November 3rd, and saying that any delays would be totally inappropriate. However, this is incorrect. And so that's where you can kind of say, here's the news hook, and here's where you need an expertise to show that that is a wrong statement. And then you kind of shift into the argument. And this is really more of the scholarly argument that you would have in a range of different articles or books. That this is an argument that's rooted in, again, my expertise. I've studied this. That it has taken weeks, even months, to find out who won the presidency. And the election night has been about entertainment, and it's now creating this demand for instant results. And so that's my scholarly argument. But the third component is perhaps the most component, and that is that question of relevance. Why should we care that at times it has taken a long time to learn who won the presidency, but over the course of the past century, we've had this heightened expectation for instant results? Why does that matter? And that's that last line, that this transformation of election night into a show that culminates with a clear winner has not always been good for democracy. And they create demands or problems for 2020 when counting every vote is essential and may take time. So that's that relevance. Why do we care about this history, and how should that shape the way that we are watching today? Another opportunity is to, that kind of hits on this question of policy, is to show, here's one that brings in kind of this debate about this conversation about a vaccine. And we had a historian of science, Joanna Radin, who's at Yale, write this piece for us last week. And this is where she's using her expertise to propose a solution to a contemporary issue, with the distribution of the vaccine. And so again, here you have a very similar structure. It starts off with, again, in yellow, that you have the announcement by Pfizer that they have this potential vaccine. But then there's this conversation about how are we going to store and distribute this vaccine that must be frozen at these very high temperatures, or very low temperatures, excuse me. And that this is a significant challenge. So again, here's the news hook. Then she brings in her argument. Rural cattle breeders offer a solution. She wrote an entire book on this cold chain in the Midwest. And so she introduces her argument about that cold chain. And then again, in that this blue component, you see here that this is why it matters. In other words, those practices honed in the American heartland offer the solution for distribution today. And so this is what we can rely on. This is the solution to this challenge that has been posed in this conversation about the vaccine. So again, you can see here those three components: the news hook, the argument, and the relevance. The last example I would just say, and this is another area for, again, thinking about ways in which you can insert your expertise into the news cycle. And the other one is what I call the counterintuitive argument. Everybody's thinking this, and I apologize, I actually see there's a typo on the slide. The title for this should be Americans Worry About 2020 Being Another 2000, not 200. So apologies for the typo. But the real worry is another 1876. So here is an example of a counterintuitive. Like, everyone is talking about this issue, but they're missing this key aspect. And this is how we actually should be thinking about it. And so here's a great example where we had two Civil War historians that said, everyone keeps talking about the 2000 election, but in fact, we need to look at the 1876 election. So again, the news hook is very much the 2020 election, the conversation about potential legal challenges, all of that. And then you go into the green. And that says, again, here's the history, here's the argument. In 1876, the very same problems we are facing today combined to form a perfect storm that led to an unprecedented electoral crisis. And then, again, that line about relevance, it can be short, but it needs to be there. So without a landslide victory on election night, we may be headed for a similar result. So why should we understand what's happening and the dynamics as they may play out? So again, all three of these examples have that same structure, the news hook, and then that nut graph. That's what a lingo that I learned working with the Washington Post. And that nut graph is where you state your argument and its relevance. This is so key as you're thinking about how to write these type of pieces. So to get into more, again, the nuts and bolts, so there's something that comes into the news and you realize, wow, you have something to say on this. This speaks directly to your expertise, and you can make an argument that really connects, that maybe provides that counterintuitive, that gives a solution to this policy challenge, that helps us understand something as it's unfolding. And you know that you have that expertise, so what do you do next? So I wanted to end by, but move into thinking about the two elements of what comes next in terms of the nuts and bolts. And the first is the pitch. You want to write a pitch, and you want to move quickly. The news cycle moves so quickly, and especially recently in 2020, the news cycle moves so quickly. So you need to move quickly, and this means dropping everything and writing this pitch and writing this piece as soon as you see the topic come into the news. Not waiting until you've graded that stack of papers, not waiting a week, doing it right now. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we frequently face with our writers who are all academics. And frequently we'll say, look, the debates about the post office and its funding has come into the news, and we'll reach out to a historian who, wrote a book about the post office. And he may say, oh, I need a week. I've got, these deadlines. No, we need it right now. And because you never know where the conversation is going to be in the week. the difference in terms of the readership is truly remarkable. If you hit the right news cycle and you can turn around a piece very quickly, you will be getting, 50, 70, 100,000 views on your work. If you even wait a day or two later, that goes down tremendously, and it might only be a couple thousand. So again, if you really want to think about reaching a broad audience, you need to move very quickly. So when something comes into the news, you want to pitch an editor. You start with a news hook. Again, you want to send an email to the editor, and you say, this is what's in the news, and here's my take on it. And you want to make sure you explain why your take on it is unique and really essential to understanding what's playing out. In short, this is your nut graph that you want to foreground in the email to the editor. You want to grab the editor's eye. We get quite a few pitches every day, and I know that our colleagues who run the entire Outlook section are probably getting at least 50 to 60 pitches a day. That is a lot of emails. So you have to really think that you want to grab the editor's eye and really show that you have something essential that they need to listen to, that their readers need to understand what is happening. The third thing that you want in your pitch email is to outline your credentials. And you should say, I am the perfect person, or I am the person to write this piece, because I have written a book on this topic. So I'm a professor here at Purdue University. I have written a book on this, or I've published these articles, and I have this expertise in this particular field. And then you want to provide a timeline of delivery or a timeline for their response. So if you think that you could get them a piece, you could say, if you're interested, I can get you a piece by 3 p.m. today. And you want to meet that deadline. If they say yes, I'll look at it at 3 p.m., they may only have an hour to really process it and make that decision. And if you miss that deadline, then you miss that opportunity. But you also want to include in there that and this is especially important if it's a breaking news item, that if you don't hear back from them by 5 p.m., you will pitch it elsewhere. So being clear with the editor, because a lot of editors will not reply to an email. If they, again, imagine you're getting 50 emails a day with pitches, you're not going to reply and say no to each of those. Rather, you're going to reply and say yes to the ones that you like. But you also don't want to, it's okay to pitch to multiple outlets at the same time, but you need to be clear that you're doing that. And you don't want two editors at different outlets to both accept a piece, thinking that they have an exclusive on it. And then, you'd have to tell one of them, never mind, I'm going with this other outlet, and you burn that bridge with that particular editor. I would emphasize that it's okay to pitch to multiple outlets. And as an editor, I will also say that when someone says, I'm pitching this to you, but I'm also pitching it to the New York Times, that sometimes makes me look twice because, you're competitive. You want to have the most breaking news or the most exciting scholarship on a particular piece of breaking news. And so it's completely fine to pitch it to multiple places, but you need to explain that in your pitch. And just to say, I'm pitching it to you, but I'm also pitching it to these other outlets. So please let me know if you want to move on it quickly. When you then go to write the piece, so generally what will happen if an editor likes your piece, he or she will reply and say, I'm really interested in this, send me a draft as soon as possible. When you're actually going into writing the piece, I thought I would just give you 5 tips in terms of how to approach this piece. One is to foreground the argument and focus on just one argument. This is one of the biggest challenges that I think scholars have when they're trying to write their perspective in just 800 to 1,000 words. So again, that's generally the word length of an op-ed is about 800 to 1,000 words. Sometimes it used to be a very hard 800 when op-eds were only printed in actual newspapers, but now that they're online, sometimes that can be a little flexible. But please do not send a 2,500 word draft to your editor, because that is just going to overwhelm them. And then they're going to likely say, this requires way too much editing work. So keep it short and focus on just one argument. You may have 5 different arguments in your book about a particular topic, or 5, sub-arguments, but in your 800 to 1,000 word op-ed piece, you need to focus on just one of those and really effectively go into depth on that one piece. And that's the second component. Bring in really compelling examples. What are some of the most vivid, powerful quotes or moments where you see your argument playing out? Bring in those what's going to grab the reader. Imagine your reader is someone who is perhaps knowledgeable about the general news cycle, but not an expert in your field. And so you need to really make it easy to understand, and using vivid examples is really to show your argument in action is really a great way to do this. When you're writing, use really short, punchy sentences. A lot of times, simple things like saying, he was right, or this was wrong, or this worked. Short and kind of varying the length of the sentences. Do not get into really long, complex sentences with all different kinds of clauses, because again, you want to make it easy for your reader to follow and to process the information that you are presenting. And that's one thing, again, really to remember, that you want someone to think that the topic is interesting just as they're clicking on their phone, they're scrolling through their news feed, but you need to keep them engaged. And if you make them work too hard to figure out how everything is connected, they're just going to move on to the next piece. There's so much writing out there that you really want to be engaging, and you want to be clear and concise in how you're making your argument. I always emphasize this idea of analytical signposts as well. Paragraphs are very short in journalism, but that topic sentence of every paragraph should kind of bring in that analytical signpost. If you're moving to a different aspect of the argument, to a different example, explain how and why that example then fits into the broader argument. Avoid academic jargon. Avoid academic jargon. I know Rosie said this with the policy brief as well. I cannot emphasize this enough. Take out anything that your non-academic friend or spouse would not know instantly. Take that out. And just really focus on simple language that the non-expert can understand. Imagine, I always think of, being at a cocktail party with all non-historians. And, I want to, make an argument about the 1960 election. But if I go into too much of the weeds, they're going to get bored. But I can bring in some really effective, compelling examples and really make a broader argument about, the shifting nature of the media environment that played out during that moment. They don't care that this scholar has argued this, and this scholar has argued this, but I'm doing it this way. They don't care about that. So really, you need to avoid the literature reviews as well. And I know that this is really hard as academics, because so much of our expertise is grounded not just in our specific research projects that we're doing, but it's grounded in understanding the literature of our field. But you really, you don't want to have to go and dig deep into those literature reviews. And one way I kind of compare this is thinking about when you're teaching, right? When you're teaching, you may not go into the historiography of every single aspect of the lecture, but you may convey the lessons of that historiography. You don't have to reference the 10 different scholars that wrote the books that helped you come to this particular interpretation. But you can, again, what are the takeaways from that scholarship? That being said, you should and can cite your material. And in fact, in op-ed writing, it's very much a challenge in public engagement on how to effectively cite all of your sources, especially if you're drawing on secondary literature. But in op-ed writing, you're actually really well poised to throw in hyperlinks here and there to really show that you're getting this information elsewhere. And if people are interested, they can follow the hyperlink, they can go see that book that was really instrumental in showing these certain things on which you're drawing for your broader argument. So there's no reason not to cite with hyperlinks. I mean, I wouldn't go excessive and have every word be linked to a different source. But absolutely, bring in that research because, again, part of what you're doing in this writing is you're modeling what we do as scholars. You're modeling how you come to an argument, how you get your particular evidence to make that argument. And so pointing them to specific sources is a great way to show to the broader public, this is what we do as historians or what you do in all of these other fields. And then they can kind of follow that path to understanding what those sources are and how you're compiling them to make your analysis. I would end just by saying that once you publish this, and this also hits at some of the points that Rosie mentioned as well, is that once you publish this, it's a great opportunity to promote it through a variety of other mediums. Social media is great. It's really great to kind of promote your work, promote it on Twitter. You can tag different policymakers or figures that may be interested in what you wrote. I once wrote a piece on celebrity mobilization in I think it was during the 2018 election that talked about Taylor Swift, and I tagged her. She did not retweet it, but it's, I was reaching. But you could always, tag people via social media that may actually read it and then promote it more broadly. Think about ways in which you can turn this into echo press. This is something that political strategists frequently talk about, is how do you take certain ideas and promote them via a variety of different mediums, and I think academics can do that as well. When you know you have a piece coming out, you can then pitch that piece to local television producers and radio producers. They are always looking for content. This is especially the case with radio, that they have hours they need to fill. And if you kind of say, look, I have this piece coming out in the Washington Post, I'd be happy to come on your show and talk with you about it. That's a great opportunity as well. And then you can also use this to then situate yourself to write at other outlets as well. So once you've perhaps written a piece for your local newspaper, then you can use that to write for more of a regional one, and then use that as a way to say, to the Washington Post, I've written these pieces previously, and I have experience. So again, it becomes sort of a resume that you can build that can then create opportunities for you as well down the road to branch into new publications. And on that point, I would really emphasize that, if you're new to this, a great way to start is local media. Working with the JNC here in Lafayette, and they're always interested in content. They're interested in what Purdue has to do, and you can start building that portfolio so that when something comes in your area of expertise, you can pitch someone at the New York Times, and you can say, look, I'm experienced in this. Here's a sample of my writing. And now I'm ready to write, for a more national audience as well. So I have a variety of other things that I can talk about, but I actually would like to stop right now and open it up to any questions. I know I covered a lot, and I'm, again, happy to talk about how you can maybe build this more into your tenure or portfolio, how you can integrate it into your teaching, all of those things. But I thought I would stop right now and open it up for any questions.
That was really a very informative presentation. Thank you so much, Katie. Any questions from any participants? You're most welcome to post them in the Q&A box that's on your screen. So while we are waiting for folks to post some of their questions or comments, I thought I'll start off with maybe getting a better understanding of how is it that you went about, creating the Made by History project, and how did you connect it to the Washington Post if, any of our other participants wanted to go down that route? Mm-hmm. Could you share your experiences with that project and how you kind of built it up, as it were.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we're very indebted in this capacity to the Monkey Cage, which is a political science vertical at the Washington Post. And that actually was an independent publication that, gained a really tremendous following and attracted the attention of the Washington Post, and then ultimately formed a partnership with them. So we saw that this had happened, and so we knew that there were a lot of historians across a range of different fields that were willing and were excited to connect to the broader public. And so we spoke with all of them, kind of gauged their interest on how frequently they would like to write, and show that there's this audience of authors that's ready and willing to go. And then we were able to, speak with the people at the Monkey Cage and get a couple ideas for sections at the Washington Post that might be interested in a historical vertical. And we, made the argument that we need an understanding of history. And the 2016 election, all of the controversy and the tumult that came out during the 2016 election made our editors say, yeah, we understand that historians can be really relevant. So we really had to make a case to them. And I think that's really what you do in all of your writing, is that you have to make a case to journalists and to editors, people whose full-time job it is to, understand, interpret, and offer perspectives on the news, why your expertise matter. And so we, really emphasize that historians have a lot to say, not just, again, about has this happened before, yes or no, but to understanding how we got to where we are today, the roots of a particular policy, why perhaps it hasn't worked in the past, what are the challenges that we face in dealing with housing, student loans, all of these really important issues that historians had something to say in terms of shaping those conversations, and also showing that there is, people are interested in history, and that we had a readership out there. So again, it's that pitch. It was a much bigger pitch, but very similar to the pitch that you do to an editor or to a journalist about why they should care about your expertise.
I think that's a very good point, because, this many a times that context to an issue or a news piece is often missing. And so, from a historian's perspective, contextualizing a lot of what is being talked about in the current context becomes very important, and I think begins to give people a better understanding of how to approach or even understand the subtle nuances of, what they're reading or what they're experiencing or what they're going through right now. Mm-hmm. So that's great. And I think perhaps the project was also in the right place at the right time. And so that, I think, certainly helped, because there was so much of that conversation going on at that point about, the historical implications of a lot of the sort of events that went on at that time.
Absolutely.
So that's
yeah, and I would also emphasize that you're going to strike out a lot. You may pitch a variety of editors, and you may never hear back. But my colleague at the Washington Post always likes to compare it to baseball, right? You're batting a 300 average. That means you do not get a hit 7 out of 10 times, and you're a really, really good baseball player. And so when you kind of think of it in that capacity, that yes, you're going to get a lot of no's, you're going to get a lot of no responses, but if you can have the skills and be the right person at that right time, then you really can get your work out there to such a broad audience.
Anyone in the audience has any questions for Katie, or if you have any comments about the very helpful tips that Katie has shared with us today? So one of the, as we are waiting, I'm happy to always
Dr.
step
Krishna?
in. Yes.
I'm not sure if you can see it from your perspective, but there have been a few questions that have come in. If you can't see it from there, I can read them. It's in the Q&A portion.
Okay, you know what? My scroller was stuck. Thank you so much, Krista. I just saw that. Excellent.
Perfect.
Thank you. So sorry about that. There are questions. Okay, so Sage has a question. Are op-eds an option for undergrad or grad students without publications or years of expertise?
That's a great question. I have my students as a classroom exercise. I have them, frequently write op-eds. I think it's a really useful assignment for the classroom. However, in terms of actually getting them placed, I think you really need to figure out their pitch, right? And that's where that line in terms of credentials really matters. Why should people care about a student's perspective on this issue? And maybe, yes, they've studied this particular topic in the classroom, but then you really need to make the argument as to why a student is best posed to actually answer, to provide insight onto this particular topic. So, I know that many students were featured in terms of their experiences on campus with it going virtual in the spring. And I know the New York Times did a whole section where they had a variety of different students, graduate students and undergraduate students, kind of write about their experiences. Again, when you have to think about, again, that pitch, right? So why should a student's experience on this topic be important? And if you can work with students to make that pitch, you absolutely should. Another, again, I would emphasize going local, right? So you might have students reach out to the exponent, and maybe they can, bring their classroom expertise and perhaps write a piece for the exponent. To the JNC, I think that there's definitely an opportunity in local media to have students start to get a publication record. For graduate students, I think that, if graduate students are, they're professionals. They're working on their professional pedigree and they're building those credentials. And, we actually publish graduate students all the time. Graduate students are so deeply enmeshed in the secondary scholarship, the historiography, that literature review, and they're working on their dissertation. And so if their dissertation comes into the news, we absolutely see that as expertise. And I know many other editors will as well.
Great, thank you. So we have another very good question from Bailey. And Bailey is wondering if people ever pitch ideas to editors ahead of time. For example, they study natural disasters. And so if there is not a current season of natural disasters, would an editor review an article for future publication, like when you actually are in the season?
Yes, so I would say two things. We get a lot of pitches sometimes on historical anniversaries. So there's this anniversary or there's a particular holiday. Again, this doesn't have to just be for historians. If there's a particular holiday coming up, Labor Day, right? And maybe this is a really good time to review certain labor union policies or issues. So if you know something is coming up, you absolutely should reach out to editors in advance. And do it in advance. It's really frustrating as an editor to get a really interesting pitch that's linked to an anniversary of some sort, or that's linked to a holiday, and I get it like 2 days in advance. That's something that you knew about, and you should absolutely be pitching the editor in advance. So we have a piece already that's already written on Thanksgiving, and so absolutely reach out in advance. If it's on something like a natural disaster, that's a really, really great point, is that that it may happen at any moment, but an editor may not bite on that particular topic until it actually happens. But here's what you can do, is you can pre-write the piece. And so that when it happens, when something happens, you have the piece ready to go. It's written. You just kind of need to add in that news hook. And so all of a sudden there may be a hurricane that's coming, or there is an earthquake somewhere, and you have something really that's an opportunity to present some of your material. Have that op-ed ready to go, and you can store it. And then you can be so incredibly timely, because while everyone is thinking, oh, how do we understand these certain things, you already have that piece ready to go, and it can hit the news cycle at that peak moment.
Great. So Andrew is asking, topic sentences or one sentences often act as paragraphs in op-ed and journalistic writing. I wasn't sure if there was a question in there. But Andrew has also asked, part of the news hook examples seem to include a straw man argument, a historical problem, or a disagreement with an expert or an elected official. Is this typically a sub-formula?
I mean, I don't think we try to avoid straw man or arguments, but I think that, because we really want it to be linked to the news cycle, part of what the challenge is that you actually see, and again, as a historian, the Trump administration frequently butchers history and invokes history in really problematic ways. So that becomes a very easy hook to say, Trump says the Civil War is about this, or is not about slavery, but in fact it is. I mean, and that may seem very basic, but when you think about certain partisan talking points and the ways that they dominate the news cycle, when you're really showing that that is problematic, I think that that's a really good entry into that news cycle, because part of this has been the challenge of doing this column during the Trump administration, where the news cycle changes so quickly, but also the White House has been a source of misinformation, and so correcting that narrative has been very much a challenge and an imperative for many of our writers. Again, it doesn't just come from the White House. Of course, that misinformation comes from a variety of other areas. So I think that, really when there's a political discussion, that people just, they're missing the root of the issue, the root of the problem, or a particular solution, that is an entryway into that news cycle.
So we have another couple of very good questions. These are from Ellen, who asks, should writing letters to the editor be a start? And then a follow-up is, you have focused on newspapers, yet we see a lot of online publications that get a lot of circulation. Are there other publications that are good to look for on certain topics?
Yes, great questions. So writing letters to the editor, I mean, that can be a start if you want to. I think that the key is to getting used to public writing. Those tend to be, again, focused mostly on opinion and not much on expertise a lot of times. And so I think that one of the great, and I think you'll have a wider readership if you can really have it be an article that you write, not just a letter to the editor. And so I think if you want to get that broader readership, think about who is running the opinion section, who is running, who you might reach out to with the news or the perspectives. Most newspapers have, again, an opinion and a news section, and that news section is actually divided into reporting the actual news, coming up with certain stories that their regular reporters on a particular beat develop. But then a lot of that is perspective, understanding what's happening around us. And that is an opportunity where you can get your expertise in there as well. In terms of other places, I mean, obviously my work has been overwhelmingly with the Washington Post, but we actually are an online-only section. Sometimes they the Outlook picks up our pieces and runs them in their print edition. But generally, all of our publications are online only, and I think that's actually the incredible opportunity for scholars today. There are so many opportunities out there. There are so many mediums, so many options, I should say, that are out there. And that's really exciting. So what I would suggest doing is think about where you like to get your news, where your colleagues are perhaps writing. And follow those sections, learn about those sections, because, even within the Post, there's so many different sections that, again, depending on your interests, depending on your area of expertise, get to know them. There's the Lily section at the Washington Post, which is just tremendous, and it focuses on a lot of issues related to women. And that's, an opportunity there to, again, if your work focuses on something, reach out to them directly. There are, the Atlantic, Slate, those are some really great resources, kind of these magazines, these traditional magazines that are online in an online format. And a lot of times they allow you to actually go into more depth. I know that Purdue has a relationship with The Conversation. And that's a really great opportunity as well, because that is a project that, you know, they frequently have different topics that they want people to pitch them on, and you can kind of work through the Purdue communications department, not the communications department, but their media and marketing team. And you can kind of work through them to see, you know, the topics that are of interest to the conversation. And then they really work with you on developing your piece. And then they run it out so that so many different publications can pick it up and reprint it for free. So you might, once wrote a piece for the conversation, and it was reprinted in USA Today, Forbes, The Nation, and a variety of other different ones that, again, I normally would not have my writing in those outlets, but because it was picked up by the conversation, that was another opportunity. So I think the conversation is definitely a really great opportunity as well.
So I would actually second that. I've had some really good experiences with the conversation, and I think if the right media outlets pick it up, it really has the opportunity. It really gives you a platform, I think, with just having to write it once to really get it out in a lot of different places. And I think, like you said, it's a very good place to start and build up that portfolio. Mm-hmm. Particularly for, you know, any students or, you know, recent graduates or recent doctoral, you know, graduates, to sort of start building that portfolio of publication. And with sort of, you know, having that kind of an audience through the conversation, it ends up being a very good way to build up to, you know, a kind of a project like Made by History.
Exactly.
Which I think it would be very helpful for everyone. So building off of the conversation, I wanted to ask, so because I have one of my pieces was a little controversial, which often happens. And as you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of people have very specific misinformed opinions about topics, particularly controversial topics. And so what has been your experience, or what is your sort of advice for engaging with that kind of a space? So, you know, when you have that kind of an online presence with material that you put out there as someone with expertise in that material, but then there are these, you know, people who think otherwise. You know, to what extent should scholars spend time engaging in that kind of a space, or do you, you know, only focus on, you know, your written portion, and then you sort of, you know, let the noise sort of, you know, stay out of that noise?
That is such an important and a great question. So my advice to authors is never read the comment section. People get in fights with one another, and it has nothing to do with your work. They might have issue with the headline, which, by the way, authors never get to pick the headline, so you have no control over that. And a lot of times they don't actually read the piece because your headline is supposed to be catchy. It's all about getting people to click on it. And a lot of times those who are writing comments, they can just be cruel and mean, and it's not engagement intellectually. So I say absolutely never read the comments. You may get emails too. I've gotten some very, very nasty emails. And this particularly is an issue for women, that women get a lot more derogatory emails that frequently will comment on their appearance, even though, you know, you may have a headshot and that might be it, but it's really something that is more targeted towards women who are stepping into the public. So there's a gender dynamic that is very much at play there. I ignore them all. I press delete. I do not engage. I do not reply. I do not engage if I get trolled on Twitter for something. I think that my work speaks for itself, and that's my approach to it. I know that some of my colleagues, one of my colleagues who's at Princeton, Kevin Cruz, loves being on Twitter and will go back and forth with some of his critics and spends a lot of time doing that. to me, and I think that in many ways, he has this war with Dinesh D'Souza, and I think that can be useful in getting his ideas out there in some capacity, and that's important for him. I personally don't have that time. I'm not very good and quick on Twitter, so I can't reply very quickly. I have to think through every tweet. So I think it's just where you want to spend your time and energy. And to me, I'd rather spend my time and energy working on my next piece and let my piece stand as it is and feel proud of that and promote it. And if people want to engage with the merits of this and perhaps debate, an idea on social media, that's one thing. But there are mean people out there. And you really see this when you publish online, and some people who will see you as a university professor and assume that you have a particular ideological bias and not listen to anything that you say, even though it is grounded in facts, and you can't change those opinions. So you can do your best by getting the information out there, presenting a compelling argument, and then there's just a limit, in my opinion, in terms of how much time you actually want to spend engaging some people who just are not listening and not truly engaging.
That's an excellent point. I did make that rookie mistake. Never again. But yes, I absolutely agree. It's, that noise absolutely has to stay away, because then it just consumes you, and then you just cannot focus on your own work and your own scholarship. So absolutely, that's a very good point. I don't think we have any other questions. I'll just take a second to see if anyone else has any other questions or comments for Katie or even Rosie. If anyone has some, this would be a time to post it. Otherwise, we will try and wrap up. Okay, sounds good. So Krista, if you want to take it from here. Thank you so much, Katie. That was an excellent session, and I think everyone would have found it very helpful.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Katie. Thank you so much, Rosie. And thanks to everyone who has joined us here this afternoon. This was a wonderful session and more to come, so please stay tuned. Take care.